Hey everyone, this is Lance Hawley at HST. I'm sitting with Kevin Shelby. He's our counseling professor here. This is the beginning of a series of conversations we are going to have about the book of Job and grief. And as Kevin has had some experience, much more than me, on grief counseling and dealing with people who are experiencing grief. He's agreed to join me in this kind of conversation. I'll talk some about the book of Job, and he'll talk some about people's real experiences, and we'll see where that all meets up. So we're going to try to frame this not as us talking to you, but us talking to each other, because we've been having these conversations. We thought we'd just share them with you. So today, wanting to just share some of the story of the book of Job, and some of my general thoughts, and Kevin will share some of his general thoughts, and we'll see where it goes. Maybe 12, 15 minutes or so.
Well, I also want to just add that, people can just expect this to be really informal, in the sense that we're not scripting this, we're just having a conversation in theology and psychology, which tend to be two disciplines that are very divided. Mm-hmm. And as I've come on at HST and in my professional experience, one of the things that I really want to do is help people understand how to integrate understanding the theology of what Scripture has to say about different things we deal with in the emotional world, and realize how that then supports the ministry that we do in psychology. So I think the book of Job gives us an excellent opportunity to begin that conversation.
Yeah, and I kind of want to set out some caveats at the beginning that I don't think the book of Job is primarily about grief.
Yeah.
And that being said, I think it has a lot to say about the grieving process, and certainly I think people who read it can grow in grief, and that's one of the themes we want to hit on. So let me give us a few, just an overview of the book. Try to make this brief, and then we'll get into our general conversation. One word that's come up in my mind is trauma, because, of course, the book of Job begins, the first two chapters, it's a narrative, it's highly stylized. It begins telling us about the character of Job. There's no one like him. He is righteous and always turns away from evil and fears God. And he's also wealthy. He's sort of surrounded in every way by family and by all of his animals, and he's basically his life has been supported and sustained by God, and that seems to have some sort of relationship to his righteousness. And of course, then it all comes crashing down in a sort of a heavenly test between God and this accuser. It's not just his stuff is taken away, it's his life is demolished. And the way that he hears about it, it's like he's standing at his door, or he's at home, and then one messenger after another comes and delivers bad news. News of disaster of his flocks, and eventually all of his possessions, and including his whole household. His children are killed by a natural disaster or a storm. And he just hears it. So it's like the most upright, righteous person has experienced the most traumatic, evil disaster. And that's a setup for the rest of the book. How is he going to deal with this? And the question is, that's asked of God is, does Job serve God for no payoff, right? No benefits. What's in it for Job? And so if you took it all away, if you destroyed his life, would he still serve you? And that's the setup for the rest of the book, and what we get to see in chapters 3 through 3 through 31, we see Job and his friends talking about it. And Job has a lot of faces, and this is one of the things I want to make sure we talk about, because on the surface, at first he confesses faith, he grieves formally, and then he flips the switch in chapter 3 and wishes for his own death, and then from that on, we'd really see Job, in an up and down, kind of a roller coaster ride of dealing with the trauma, and typically that part of Job's faith is not a part of the narrative that gets told. This is just a setup for several conversations, but one thing I thought we might talk about today is just how Job isn't consistent in his grief. It's not like he goes through 5 formal steps of grief in a particular order. There's some sort of progression in his character from dealing with, the shock of the trauma, and then immediately into sort of escapism. I just want out. I just want to die. But then, and that's his hope, but then his hope progresses toward wanting like this face-to-face with God. He wants to tell God off, and he does tell God off. But then he sort of grasps onto this resolution. It's like, man, if I could just get God to pay attention to me. And there's several kind of faces of grief in Job, but it's not, the 5 steps type of thing.
It's almost like he's experimenting with grief. Right? Then he doesn't follow like a linear progression. It's more, as we've talked about before, it's non-linear, in that there's not some step-by-step process. So somehow Job feels the freedom to just sort of be where he is, and it's almost like he slides into the next experiment in some ways, right? I mean, it's not like there's an intention to go to the next thing.
Yeah, you'll be reading one chapter and you'll see different attempts within it. It's just, he's a mess. But that's how people who are suffering are. Right. There's no logic necessarily to how it works. At least that's my understanding.
Well, I mean, so often I think when you're thinking about grief and the process that people go through, and when I've heard it compared to the book of Job in the past, I've heard people talk about how he maintained his righteousness, and how that's sort of the theme. Like, don't let yourself stray into the ugliness that you want to as a result of your pain. And yet, from these experiments in grief, it seems like Job is sort of allowed to, he's allowing himself and within his community to experience it as it comes. And he's not forcing himself, and nobody else is forcing him to deal with it in a specific way and saying you have to do it, except for people who are telling him the ultimate answer is to curse God and die, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. He never gives up. He never does that, right? But he comes really close.
Yeah, and that's what people, I think, don't you think people miss that sometimes in the narrative, that he gets to the edge of what theologically at that time would have been considered the ultimate sin, right?
Yeah, I think he and those around him understand that if he would curse God, he would die. Like, that's the easy way out in some way. Because it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. If you blaspheme God, or speak a curse against God, he would strike you down. Yeah. So Job doesn't take that easy way out. Right. But he really wants out. Like, everything has been destroyed. He can't sleep at night. God is giving him nightmares. He's feeling tortured by God. We could diagnose him with PTSD if he was in a counseling situation. Yeah, and that's one thing I want to be really careful about too. Because Job is an ancient literary character. I mean, this is where I always want to push back on. Like, I don't want to over psychologize, if that's the right word. Job, because it's a highly structured book, and it's written, I think, to bring up themes of, God's justice, friendship, the meaning of suffering, and disinterested piety. In other words, are you pious? Are you faithful in spite of injustices? Yeah, those types of things are the point of the book. Right. And yet, I think when we're talking about grief, there is a significant theme of how to grieve, how to grieve well. Not that it's first step 1, step 2, step 3, but this is an example of somebody who takes it to God. Job never decides to stop talking to God.
Right.
He laments and he speaks words without knowledge, as God will eventually say in chapter 38 that Job has spoken ignorantly,
right,
and darkening his counsel. But he always talks to God. And actually, we'll talk some about the friends in future conversations, but
sure.
The friends don't talk to God. They just talk to Job. And if there's something significant in Job's grief is he keeps on talking, even if it's not pious.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important point in terms of like the methodology or how he goes about grieving. Really, to both of us, is more of an asterisk to what we would also want to look at in terms of the character of God.
Yeah.
And who God is, and the book seems to, and you're the expert here, so you tell me if this is true, but it seems to hold the character of God in a certain esteem that even Job assumes from the onset that the character of God is good, right? And
yeah, well, I think as a reader of the book and as somebody who's grieving, you wrestle with that.
Yeah, of
because
course.
God, we can talk more about is God unjust in the book of Job. I think that's a really legitimate question. He will say in chapter 2, verse 3, that the accusers forced his hand to he's incited him to cause this suffering on Job for no reason,
right,
for no just cause. For testing's sake.
That's hard.
That's hard. Yeah, it is hard. And I think trauma is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned PTSD and all of these other things, those real experiences that people are experiencing day to day. This is why I think the book of Job has so much appeal, and it should have so much appeal, because it gives a voice to this kind of dissenting voice. And yeah, God's character is called into question, and we can talk more about like what's in the speech of God in the end, or the conclusion of the book of Job, which we haven't gotten to, when he's restored. What kind of restoration is that? Is new kids? I mean, there's some things that should rub against us.
Sure.
I think should rub us wrong in the book of Job, but it's a book that wrestles, and that's what grief is. It's not something that's looking for, grief is not something that you do and then you're done with, right? It's something you grow in.
Yeah, so, and I think that's the point, is like, as we deal with people that are grieving, so often they're given a prescription of what that's supposed to look like. There's 10 steps to everything out there right now, including grief.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times people come to their grief,
mm-hmm.
and they have a feeling or a sense as though I'm not where I'm supposed to be in this timeline,
mm-hmm.
or my grief looks different than what's being described out there.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hearing everyone else is supposed to go through, and that's why I think it's so important that we can understand a book like Job, where his grief doesn't follow this specific progression, and he doesn't have to have some sort of method to his grief.
Mm-hmm.
Because it isn't necessarily, he's not necessarily wrestling with getting over his pain. He's wrestling with his relationship with God, right? I mean, he's not necessarily trying to just figure out a way to get rid of this hurt.
Yeah, those two are, I think, together.
Yeah, it's not
right.
Just this, and that's what grief tends to be about.
Mm-hmm.
We want to figure out a way to get rid of the pain.
Yeah,
and if we're trying to get rid of the pain, and we're not doing these experiments with God the Father, who brings that ultimate healing to our soul, then we're really just creating an avoidance pattern within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really the challenge, is to shift our thinking about who God is, which which is what the book of Job is wrestling with,
Yeah.
who man is with God, and then not necessarily being pigeonholed into a certain way of
Right.
going about dealing with our pain.
Yeah. You were telling me a story earlier, and I thought
Yeah.
you should share it, and then maybe you can wrap it up.
Yeah, a good example of this, just a real quick story. There's a gentleman that I was counseling at one point, and he had lost his wife, and it had been a year. And he said, Kevin, every night I still kiss her picture, before I go to sleep. And he said, is that weird? Like, is there something wrong with me? And my response was absolutely not. Your process of grieving and the things that you do to deal with the pain and the trauma of losing somebody is your process. And when I gave him the freedom to do that, it was like I saw this just sense of relief come over him, because he'd seen, the steps of the cycle of grief, and he'd read all this stuff about it, and it was like, I don't fit that mold. I'm still kissing my wife's picture a year later.
Yeah.
I'm not done. I'm not over it. The pain isn't gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that was troublesome to him, until I said, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Where you are is right where you need to be. And I think that's, to me, that's what's so important about these conversations from a counseling perspective. We've got people maybe that are watching this conversation, or that we'll talk to, that the holidays bring up some really painful moments. I would have the same message for them. You may be 10 years away from a loss, and every Christmas it hurts, and that's okay. Because the pain of losing somebody is real, and it's not something you fix. It's not a problem that you just go and get better from,
Yeah.
And so I hope that encourages us,
Yeah.
as we look at the book of Job. And
That's good. Okay. Well, I think we are going to talk about this a lot in the future. And next time, we want to have a conversation sort of at the first experiment in grief.
yeah, which is what?
I think it's the formal grief, right? It's the confession that Job makes at the beginning, and of faithfulness.
Is that
but
the
also
moment where he
tearing
worships?
robes, and he worships. He tears his robes. He shaves his head, and he worships. And he falls to the ground, and then he makes this confession, that he's going to be faithful. I want us to think about, give that legitimate voice for the formal ceremony of grief. So anyway, we'll talk about that next time, and maybe see how far we get. Then the next one would be to talk about chapter 3, when he's wishing for death.
Yeah.
Escapism. So, hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching if you made it all the way to the end, and tune in next time. We'll see you guys.
See you later.